It has been 1 year since the COVID-19 pandemic shattered our reality and stopped the world in its tracks. Here's Dr. Anthony Fauci and former President Trump last year at this time.
We will see more cases and things will get worse than they are right now.
We will be suspending all travel from Europe.
It goes away. It's going away. We want it to go away with very, very few deaths.
I am officially declaring a national emergency. Two very big words. We're now in very, very strong shape.
In his first primetime speech to the nation, President Joe Biden looked back at one of the deadliest years in American history and charted a path forward.
We've lost so much over the last year. We've lost family and friends. We've lost businesses and dreams we spent years building. But as I stand here tonight, we're proving once again something I've said time and time again. It's never, ever a good bet to bet against the American people. America is coming back.
This Wednesday, Dr. Fauci gave a dose of hope to a weary nation.
Things are going much better in the right direction, particularly because of the scientific advances that allowed us to have now multiple highly efficacious vaccines. But we're not out of the woods yet.
Tonight, we have invited back a panel of reporters who joined our show during the first terrifying weeks of this crisis. Yasmeen Abutaleb, national health policy reporter for The Washington Post, Eamon Javers, senior Washington correspondent for CNBC, Toluse Olorunnipa, national political reporter for The Washington Post, and Susan Page, Washington bureau chief for USA Today. Let's take a listen to what our panelists had to say in March 2020.
You've seen the president has still sought to downplay the risk of the virus, even as we've seen the number of cases in the U.S. climb over the last week and pop up in more than a dozen states.
President Trump's sort of play it by ear, fly by the seat of your pants approach does not work well within a political crisis that stems from a global pandemic.
This is an existential threat for President Trump. In a way, impeachment was not. It's already changed the political landscape for 2020.
That the pilot light in the economy could be about to go out, and we might not have the ability to restart that.
Yasmeen, this pandemic pressure tested the country's healthcare infrastructure like never before. What did we learn about the state of our healthcare system?
I think the pandemic exposed, the many weaknesses that we might have known theoretically existed in the healthcare system or maybe encountered in a sort of less severe way. But this really brought a lot of it to the forefront. The U.S. has an extremely decentralized healthcare system, which I think made it very difficult for different regions and counties and cities to have the surge capacity they needed as they grappled with outbreaks. You saw it happen in New York City, in New Orleans, in Chicago, and major metropolitan areas all across the country. And it also made it very hard to coordinate a federal response because the federal government can make recommendations, but ultimately decisions fall to state and local leaders.
Toluse, this was not an equal opportunity pandemic. Black and Latino communities suffered much of the hardship, not just due to the virus, but the economic effects of it. And then in the middle of it all, we have this racial justice uprising following the death of George Floyd in police custody in Minneapolis. In the last year, how has this country's attitudes towards racial inequality changed or at least been challenged?
Well, you can see the change in administrations. If you look at how former President Trump talked about a lot of these issues compared to how the new president, President Biden, and his vice president, the first African-American woman to be a vice president, talk about these issues. They talk about racial justice every time they talk about policy, whether it's healthcare, whether it's housing, whether it's police reform and accountability. All of these issues are now top of mind, and they're now being discussed at a national level, in part because of all of these various issues that you mentioned, from the pandemic, which we saw had a disproportionate impact on Black and brown communities, especially on poor Americans in particular. And when you talk about the racial justice movement that happened over the summer, we're now seeing that spread not only into issues related to policing, but if you look at the American Rescue Plan that Joe Biden just signed into law, a lot of the issues from poverty to education to healthcare. A lot of these issues are issues that are especially relevant for African American and Hispanic communities that have been left behind, as we've seen during this pandemic. So I imagine that that kind of policymaking will continue to be what we see from this administration, because they've started in this first 50 days really centering these issues and making them at the forefront of our public policy.
Eamon, fortunately, the pilot light did not go out, but due in large part to trillions of dollars that the government pumped into the economy over the last year. At the same time, workers have suffered, small businesses have suffered, many have closed their doors forever. What is the state of the U.S. economy and its workers, and how healthy is it?
I mean, it's a mixed bag right now, right? I mean, economists talk about this K-shaped recovery where one group of people is going up and the other group of people is going down. And that's sort of what we've seen is this bifurcated response. You've had a lot of white-collar workers who, through the miracle of technology, have been able to shift all of their work to home in a surprisingly seamless way. It's actually worked. This great experiment that we're in as a nation has really worked. It might not look like it, but I'm sitting in my basement right now next to the laundry machine and the dog crate right here. And yet I'm able to do my job, right? That's not the case for a huge number of Americans, though, who have to physically go to their jobs and be exposed to the coronavirus in order to do it. So for those people, this has been an economic depression, and that's why we're seeing that K-shaped recovery. We are starting to turn the corner on it. The free fall in jobs that we saw in April has turned around. We saw more than 300,000 jobs created last month, but we're still about 8.5 million jobs in the hole total since this pandemic began. And that's a long, long way to still dig out. Hopefully, we can start to really begin to increase those numbers on a month-to-month basis and get a lot of people back to work once the vaccinations start to roll out here.
Susan, obviously our politics have changed. The country chose Joe Biden over Donald Trump to lead it out of the pandemic. I'm curious what you made of his speech last night and what you think it tells us about his leadership style going forward in this year.
You know, I think that Joe Biden can credit the COVID pandemic as the biggest single factor that contributed to President Trump's failure to win a second term. It put Joe Biden in the White House, and it gave his presidency a mission. His presidency will be judged by more than by any other single factor by how he does in handling this pandemic. And we saw such a different tone, such a different approach between the two presidents' remarks that you showed at the beginning of this hour, between the kind of defiant tone that President Trump took, kind of denying that this was going to be this sort of dreadful experience it has been. In contrast, we had a very much more somber tone from President Biden, as we've heard from the mourning what we've lost. But in this speech, his first speech to the nation since becoming president, I think he did adopt a more optimistic, a more hopeful tone, saying we can see the light at the end of this tunnel. Let's keep together. Let's do what we need to do. By the 4th of July, things are going to be much better.